Well, as you know, our gathering today honours Rumana Monzur, our colleague and friend at St. John's College, who has been the victim of unspeakable violence at the hands of her husband and in the presence of her daughter. We call this domestic violence, but more broadly, it speaks of the way culture has always been written on our bodies, and most egregiously on the bodies of women and girls at the hands of men. Nobel Prize winner, economist Amartya Sen has pointed out how cultural norms such as male preference, inheritance rights, medical care, and so on, continue to quietly tell us this terrible story of inequality and neglect, leading to the excess mortality of women. We know, for example, that females have better survival rates than men at birth. 0.98 men to 1 women is the norm. But Amartya Sen shows us that in China, for example, that is dramatically reversed. The ratio of men to women is far higher. 1.06 boys for every 1 girl. So he translates this into actual numbers. He says this means that in China alone, there are 50 million women missing that should be there, but are not there. And when he adds in South and West Asia and the Middle East, he puts the number higher, at more than 100 million missing women. So it's the long-standing preference for boys that tells us about such cultural traditions in China where the bucket of water at the side of a birthing woman is for washing the boy or drowning the girl. Patriarchal cultures have allowed the elimination of unwanted females in all sorts of ways. Treated women as property and slaves, bound their feet, mutilated their genitals, maintained honor codes, and perceived marital slights and male sexual demands that encourage the battering and use and abuse of women and girls at so many levels. Now, of course, poverty exacerbates these problems, including lack of education and social support. But domestic violence enters every door. It is seen plentiful on our own doorstep, as well as far away and hidden for sight. It's a global epidemic that kills, tortures, and maims. It's one of the most pervasive of human rights violations. So today we've got 4 wonderful panelists who are going to address these issues from a number of critical perspectives: the law, culture, policy, and grassroots issues. And each panelist will speak for about 10-15 minutes. And then I'll encourage questions from the audience to the panel and also encourage general discussion. So we will start with Louisa Russell, who is from the Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Studies. And Louisa, I will turn it over to you to tell us issues at the grassroots, right? Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say it's women's shelter.
I wanted to
work at a shelter.
What did I say?
University. Women's Studies.
Oh. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Beaker and Maureen, for your leadership and for making this panel happen. I'd like to acknowledge also that we're on Coast Salish territories before I begin. As you mentioned, I work at a transition house. It is a sanctuary for women escaping male violence. It's free and available to everyone, regardless of status in Canada. In the transition house, I see the impact of men's violence and how it shapes the lives of women and their children. This week alone, I saw a child with a choked neck, a mother with bruises down her legs. I played a game with a boy that is now painstakingly shy since he was sexually assaulted by his male older family member. I talked with his mother, who still blames herself for not being able to prevent the attack. I saw a 6-year-old boy apprehended from his mother's arms because social services and the police could not stop the father's violence and keep him in jail, despite recommendations to do so. My shift partner, when I very first came to work at Rape Relief 10 years ago, had her daughter killed at a money mart in Vancouver. Every shift partner I've worked with since has an experience, and so do I. There have been times when I've stayed up at night, not being able to sleep, or woken with nightmares about some of what I've seen at the battered women's shelter, of what I've heard women tell me around the kitchen table, and from what I have read from monitoring the media and accruing frontline knowledge. We all have the savage attack in our minds of Ramuna's husband, and can only imagine the horror for the daughter that experienced it. Not all of the violence that I see, of course, is that horrendous, but by the same token, some of it is greater. One woman every week in Canada is killed by her husband. That is 50 women a year that will be dead by the end of this year. It's more common for me to see and hear about the punches and kicks and threats and the intimidation. However, we know that there are currently at least 500 missing and murdered Indigenous women from these streets alone. Tonight, I want to convince you that in actual fact, all women have experienced male violence at some point in her life, and that this is not an individual problem of one woman, but a problem faced globally by everyone that is born a girl, and that we can only solve the problem together. Tonight I want to tell you about how at Rape Relief we apply a three-pronged approach to ending violence against women. And finally, I hope to leave you with some real practical tools that you can take to build on from the initiative that we've already seen from the women at this college. I was told that many of you tonight would be from St. John's College, and that likely some of you were international students. Canada has a reputation worldwide for women's equality and fairness in our criminal justice system. Many women tell me that they were led to believe that things here in Canada would be different. But I challenge you that there's not one woman in this room that has not been troubled at some point here on campus that you might be attacked to. Whether it is jogging in the Pacific Rim Park, in the park where Wendy Ladner, the sister of the MLA, was found dead and murdered in recent years, or if you've doubted the security guards on campus, because we know we've had reports of them, and after the rapes and the sexual assaults on campus, or if you found yourself checking your drink at a party for the third or fourth times, or if you've avoided breaking up with a boyfriend because of what he might do and wondering where you might go. Perhaps it was the horrors of the Montreal massacre that creep into your mind when you teach or when you are sitting in your engineering class. There's no woman that escapes male violence in Canada or anywhere else in the globe. There's no culture that exists in the world that does not rape and beat their women. I am from a white, British, middle-class Church of England culture, and my father hit my mother, and her church told her to stand by her man. We are no different. I don't mean to diminish the additional burdens of women of color or poor women. I just want to stop all of the mythology that it's only brown men in foreign countries that beat their wives. Our transition house is packed with women from all races and all nationalities. Men of all races and classes rape and beat, and women all over the world resist and rise up. So how do we resist this violence? At Rape Relief, I was saying at the beginning, we take a three-pronged approach to it. The first prong being the creation and the maintenance of women-only space. Over the past 38 years of operating, it's proven to be the most successful strategy, more endurable and lasting than using the police. We've literally saved tens of thousands of lives. Each year, 1,400 new women call us, and 120 women and their children live with us. The brilliance of this strategy is that it only takes the power of ordinary people to empathize in a way that leads to collective action. In the house, other women that are currently under attack group with each other to create women-only space. My participation in that process as a worker has been a very humbling experience. Women who are homeless because of men's violence against them voluntarily look out for other women. They keep their spirits up, they help each other with childcare, look out for each other's attackers, they share stories and they embolden each other. Sometimes women in the house ask me, why do I do this work? I say, because I know you would do the same for me. Because it's not me currently having to go through what you are, but I know because I'm a woman that it could be me. Without women helping women, we don't have a chance. I'm not the only one. There are hundreds that join our training group every month to learn how to answer the rape crisis line and work in the house. They don't have any special training or expertise to start with, just their own experience of growing up as a girl into their womanhood and knowing what it's like to live with the threat of violence or have actually dealt with her own attack. We do this work because despite all the gore, there is also the resiliency of women fighting back. Rape Relief mobilizes literally thousands of women through our Rape Crisis Center. Each call for help is an act to refuse to be silenced and live in fear. And we mobilize just as many who are not currently being attacked in order to be able to serve on their behalf. The second approach that we take is to work within the system and to go about achieving some legal reforms, improving the police and criminal justice response, improving the living conditions of women. It's now well documented and researched that male violence against women is preventable. There's a direct correlation between men's violence and women's equality. Less than 1% of the women in the world have their own place. Women's autonomy is directly tied to her ability to live without abuse. In this particular incident, Rumana, like many international students here tonight, as a result of colonization, were forced to migrate from two third worlds countries to access the prestige and the recognition of North American universities. Once here, UBC accepted the brilliance of this scholar, but she paid the awful price of not having her daughter safely with her. If Canada had such basic provisions as childcare programs, perhaps this attack could have been prevented. If we had educational systems that recognized the needs of women on campus, there would have been adequate provisions. Battered women and their supporters have campaigned for decades for childcare, and they've told us that if they had such a simple basic right, they would have left their abusive partners. There are other basic social spending policies that could make a real difference and stop violence against women. They're simple, they're straightforward. You can read about them if you go to our website. Just Google Vancouver Rape Relief. As graduates of UBC, I'm not saying they'll stop everything, but they would put a big dent in it. As graduates of UBC, the ability that you have to make a difference in ending violence against women will be really great. How you vote, how you live, how you protest, how you pressure your government, how you donate has power and influence in a way that is really significant. Your smarts, your credentials give you status both in Canada and for those visiting in your own home countries. It's your privilege and it's your burden too. If you choose to use it to make a difference in sexism, if you choose to use it in a way to speak for those that cannot speak for themselves, it will count. I already know that you deeply empathize with this situation. You responded by calling this meeting, you organized it, you invited us to speak, you raised close to $40,000. It's a good start. And there are many more things that can be done now too. We're not helpless. Some of you might leave tonight thinking you've already done enough by attending, by donating to the fund. But I want you to consider, will it be enough and will it really make a difference considering what we already know? Men hit women to get and maintain control over women. So they usually hit women where they can get away with it. You won't see the bruises most of the time, or the impacts when you're working or walking down the street. So it's easy to close your doors and your hearts to the suffering. You can do, but there are things you can do. I'm going to leave that part to skip ahead so that. No, I'll just carry on. There's a million ways that you can do that. The easiest way is to blame her. If she had gotten a legal divorce and left sooner, secured childcare, if she'd not married him in the first place, if she'd just been nicer, he might have been more cooperative. You can say that to yourself. You can say, I would have left him if it had been me. You can limit yourself to what you read in the mainstream media. You can always refuse to know. There was a time when I was envious of people that could live that way. but I know now that they don't have any fewer nightmares than I do. Choosing to live in a world where you can't see violence against women, nor its resistance, leads to ignorance and cynicism. In my opinion, there is no escape from the nightmares. Willfully unimaginative people also see monsters, and once more, those that choose to not empathize create more monsters. By this I mean, if we, I have examples. If we look at the Peter Lee case in Victoria, when he killed his wife and his 6-year-old son, Christian Lee, there were 2 Crown that released him, even though they knew that Crown Counsel that released him, even though they knew of his past violence. There was the Justice of the Peace that released David Allen Shoburn, even though he knew that he had been very violent towards his wife Darcy and Merritt before he killed their 3 children. We know that the police tried to bring forward charges, recommend charges against Picton, the pig farmer, and they refused based on her credibility. And then he was allowed to continue to go on to kill so many more women. All of those that refused to act colluded with those individual men's violence, and through their own apathy, they allowed the attacks to continue here. In order to make a difference in ending violence, I mostly just have to show up at my work and cheerlead. By the time a woman calls me for help, she's already decided enough is enough. My job is just to get behind her and say, I'm right here, go for it, you can do this, I'm beside you. For you, it will be harder. First, you'll have to apply your understanding and empathy to even hear or see the story of violence. You'll have to believe that it exists in your classroom, in your family, in your work, in order to be responsive to it. You'll have to convince others that you are someone that is safe to tell. Perhaps she will tell you because you will build a reputation for doing right by battered women or on equality issues. Perhaps because you put a poster up in your office, or because you ask and tell her that it's okay to tell. Once she does entrust you with the details, you'll have the choice to empathize and act, to connect her to a local shelter and to help follow her lead of what it will take to leave and get to safety. It's no easy job, but that's what it will take if you want to make a difference. Some of you may choose to think bigger and bolder. You may want to imagine working in a coalition on legal and policy reforms, and you'll have to figure out how to work from an academic perspective with frontline workers, or you'll risk making reform mistakes. It will be slow and frustrating, and you won't make any money probably. But, we can take tips from, or you can take the lead from Janine Benedet and look at some of the achievements that she's worked by being in coalition with frontline groups. I encourage you to know your allies in this classroom. Today you came together because of your other classmate, and to maintain those friendships over time. They'll count. And I encourage you to find out who your local rape crisis center is and transition house if you move out of Vancouver. If not, I hope that you'll get to know us more, and that you'll meet them in person, that you'll decide to either volunteer or donate to that local women's group and get a working relationship with them. Identify yourself as one of the ones that is imagining a different world, and be at service with them.
Thank you so much, Louisa, for really sketching it out, violence on the ground. So we have 2 lawyers now. We're going to start with Susan Boyd, who's the chair of Feminist Legal Studies here at UBC. Susan.
Great, thank you, and thank you, Louisa. And also, I'd echo all the thanks that Louisa already gave to the organizers. It's really great that you've brought us all together here tonight. So it turns out that Rumana Monzur had spoken with her husband about possibly leaving him. And I also understand from an article in the Vancouver Sun that Rumana's father had been quoted as saying that he thought that the reasons for the husband's attack had to do with, quote, her academic ambitions, living abroad, or his sheer jealousy and inferiority complex. Rumana has also said that her husband was furious when she told him that she wanted to leave and come to Canada to enroll at University of British Columbia. So if it sounds as though the husband's violence had something to do with his anger that his wife was exercising independence and resisting the expectations of wives in traditional patriarchal marriages, I think you would not be wrong. So what I want to speak to you about tonight is what the scholarly literature that I've been looking at over the last couple of days says about the relationship between violence against women and women's resistance to patriarchal values and their struggle for autonomy within intimate relationships. And I want to emphasize, and Louisa's already done this very well, that the literature does not suggest that violence against women is a culturally specific phenomenon, say, peculiar to Bangladesh. Rather, women in Canada and, as we've heard, all around the world have suffered the same type of violence, sometimes lesser, but sometimes more, that Rumana did, very unfortunately. That's not to say that culture is unimportant, only to say that, or at least I would suggest that it's patriarchal culture that's significant, and that this set of attitudes can be found in all countries and cultures to one degree or another. But to put a slightly more positive slant on all this, I think we can also say that in every country around the world, women and men, some women and men, are struggling to resist these attitudes and practices. So that's our bit of optimism so far. What I'm going to focus on in my remarks is so-called separation abuse. So I'm going to take us back to 1991 when an American feminist law professor called Martha Mahoney published an important article called Legal Images of Battered Women, redefining the issue of separation. So I think she was the person who coined the term separation assault, and here's how she defined it. Separation assault is an attack on the woman's body and volition in which her partner seeks to prevent her from leaving the relationship, retaliate for the separation, if she's already gone, or force her to return. So that was Mahoney's definition of separation assault. And in her 1991 article, Mahoney basically suggested that battering arose out of a struggle for power in the home, specifically, quote, the batterer's quest for control of the woman. And she argued that battering was a response to women's struggle against male domination within the family. Now, the fact that separation abuse does happen is a reminder to any of us who've ever asked the question, why doesn't she leave? Why doesn't a woman leave a violent relationship? Because what the studies show is that quite clearly, sometimes, not always, but sometimes leaving can be unsafe. In fact, women who try to leave a relationship or who leave are at high risk of being killed. And most marriages, by the way, in Canada are ended by women rather than men. So there's an interesting gender component there as well. What the studies show is that separated and divorced women are at an elevated risk for non-lethal violence compared to married women. Which isn't to say that married women aren't at any risk at all. It's just to say that there can be an extra risk, an elevated risk for women who are attempting to separate. And what the studies show is that separated women had as much as 30 times the risk of non-lethal violence as married women, and divorced women had as much as 9 times the risk. So that's pretty significant. As well, women are most at risk of homicide within the first several months after separating from a male partner. The studies also show that men are far more likely to use control-motivated violence than women are. So what this literature, and I'm really summarizing it quite quickly here, what this literature suggests is that male violence is often, not always, but often a question of power and control, and could be an attempt by a man to restore his power if he feels unable to fulfill basically the patriarchal ideal of masculinity. What the studies also show is that predictors of both pre- and post-separation abuse include, these are the key predictors, conjugal violence and abuse that has happened in the past, so while the relationship was still together, male partner control, and also mental health problems. And here I want to add a caveat, because you might be thinking by now, why would you ever suggest or try to support a woman in separating from a partner if it's so risky, right? So I don't want to suggest that any of us in this room should not be assisting women to leave abusive relationships. And so what the studies also show is that separation can be a protective factor against sublethal violence by male ex-partners, that is, assaults and emotional abuse. So in other words, it's certainly true that when women do manage to leave violent or abusive relationships, that can actually be a protective factor against future violence. So we have to balance out what these studies are saying. So I now want to turn to the question of children, which is something that I do research on. I basically do research on family law, and that includes research on disputes over children when parents separate. And one of the things that I found in some of these studies is that for men who have not been violent in the past, in a relationship, or at least haven't been reported to be violent in the past, the odds of them engaging in physical violence post-separation, so after separation, were significantly increased by various factors, including co-parental conflict. So what I take that to mean is conflict over where the children are going to live, who's going to have primary decision-making over children, and so forth. And since the 1970s, in many countries, including Canada, the trend has been to encourage mothers and fathers in heterosexual relationships that split up to share parenting after separation or divorce. And orders and agreements for joint custody have been on the rise, and they're now approaching about 50% of custody orders that are made in divorce courts. And what this means, practically speaking, is that mothers are now expected by the legal system and in terms of social norms to ensure that their children have a good relationship with their father, sometimes at the cost of the mother's own safety. So not only do fathers who have battered the mothers of their children now feel entitled to have their children or have contact with their children, because that's basically where the legal system has gone, but men can also use the legal system, the family law system, to restrict the extent to which a mother is able to exercise autonomy and live apart from her abuser. And why is this? Well, it's because the family law system now distinctly favors contact between fathers and children. And I'll give you an example from just one case that actually started out here in British Columbia but ended up being decided by an Alberta court in 2002. In this case, a father was convicted of violently assaulting and injuring his wife and her parents with a hammer. In fact, he broke the mother's shoulder. Prior to this event, he had agreed to take an anger management course after a peace bond had been issued through the criminal justice system. And he had finished that anger management course just the day before the hammer event, which might raise a question in your mind as to the effectiveness of anger management courses, but anyway. Unfortunately, when this assault happened, or after it happened, as is not atypical, he was not given a very heavy penalty by the criminal courts. He was given a conditional sentence of 14 months plus a victim fine surcharge. And about a year later, he went to the family court system to ask for contact with his two sons, for an access order with his two sons. The sons were 2.5 years old and 5 years old. As might not surprise you, the mother opposed him being given an order to have contact with the sons. The court struggled with this a little bit, but in the end did order access to the father. It was to be supervised for a certain period of time, and what often happens with supervised access is that after some months of supervising the contact, the visits between father and child, then the supervision part of the order will be lifted. And what I want to do is tell you what the rationale of the judge was in making this order for contact. What he said was that it was very, very important for a child to have at least some contact with a father, and that denial of access should be the last resort. The judge said, and this is a quote, "The father obviously misses seeing his two sons very much," close quote. And the judge added that it wasn't apparent that the visits would emotionally harm the children. He also talked about the fact that denying access to the father would be punitive to the father, who had already been punished through the criminal courts. So I think the message that comes out of cases like this, and this is just one, is that abusive behavior, spousal abuse, may not be viewed as relevant to custody and access decisions about children. In other words, an abuser can still be a good father. And maybe that's sometimes true, but I think my overall point would be that there is perhaps a little bit too much optimism on the part of many judges that we can sever this issue of being a good father versus basically being a good partner or spouse. The other thing is that women who are viewed as having exaggerated claims of violence against them can easily be categorized or caricatured, I think, by a judge as being manipulative and as trying to garner extra sympathy for her custody case. So in a case such as the one that we've heard about and why we're here tonight, that's pretty clear evidence of pretty extreme abuse. But sometimes, and it was witnessed, but sometimes, and I think Louisa alluded to this, abuse is not necessarily evident or witnessed by third parties, and that can cause a real problem when women attempt in the family law system to make an argument about what safety would mean for herself or her children. So I'm going to stop soon. I just wanted to say again, trying to inject a little bit of optimism into what we're talking about tonight. Of course, many efforts have been made over the course of many years, including by people in this room, to heighten awareness of the relevance of spousal violence and violence against women to issues like custody and access law, and the economic issues that women face in the family law system when they do manage to separate from an abusive partner. But I think that what I see too often, at least in the child custody decisions, is a kind of soft pedaling or diminishing of the abuse that does happen and its impact, not just on the woman, but also on the children. Again, I go back to this point of, I think a lot of people in the justice system think that it's easy to separate out abusive behavior to another adult versus what is in the best interest of children. There seems to be a disconnect there. And I think I'll stop there, but if you want to talk a bit more afterwards in discussion period about how this all plays out in the family law system, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. That's really interesting, and I think will be interesting to open to discussion. But let's hear a little bit more about the law, probably from a slightly different perspective, from Janine Benedet, who's also in our Faculty of Law at UBC.
Well, thank you, Patricia, and thank you to everyone at St. John's College for inviting me and for your interest that you're taking in the issue of male violence against women. And thank you also to Louisa for those kind remarks about working in coalition with Rape Relief and other women's groups locally. It's the best work I've ever done, and I've learned so much from them. I'm really on the receiving end of a lot as a result of that, far more than I give back. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight in the time that I have with you As a scholar who studies male violence against women with a particular interest in sexual violence against women, which doesn't arise that we know from the case that's brought us here today, but also just in terms of the way that we understand male violence against women and how that feeds into some of the legal system's responses to it. So I start from the proposition that what we're talking about here is a gendered crime of violence that both reflects sex inequality and reinforces sex inequality. That, in a basic way, is how I understand male violence against women in the context of domestic relationships, but in a broader context as well. And so what I'm saying is that I think that male violence against women, including violence by men against their spouses, should be understood as an act of sex discrimination. And I can talk more about that kind of phrasing, but that's how I understand what is happening. Now, the media narrative here in Canada has suggested that when Ms. Monzur tried to sort of change the balance that I'm talking about of male power over women by pursuing higher education abroad, this triggered violence by her husband. And as I understand it from the report, she in turn was falsely accused of infidelity by her husband, which was widely reported in the media in Bangladesh. Which I've also learned has a new domestic violence law as of 2010, but apparently not a lot of will to implement it. And embedded in that kind of news summary that I've seen repeated in different ways at different times are what I think are two problematic assumptions about men's domestic violence against women that I want to explore a little bit with you. The first thing that troubles me about this kind of coverage or this kind of quick summary of what happens in cases like this is that it can be understood as saying that the woman is the cause of the violence. And some of the previous speakers have already alluded to this. And I don't mean that the media are blaming her for her own attack, although it can be that too, depending on what it is she did to supposedly trigger this violence, as if it made a difference whether it was infidelity or higher education or anything else. But generally speaking, there's a kind of attribution of responsibility that comes from this idea that she does things that anger him, and that causes him to explode and be violent. And some of those things might be more acceptable than others, but that's where it's coming from. But we know in this case, tragically and not surprisingly, that Ms. Monzur has acknowledged that this abuse at the hands of her husband has been occurring for a decade or more. Probably long before she ever decided to pursue education here in Canada. That abuse that she experiences, and although I completely agree with what Susan's had to say about the risk, increasing and decreasing depending on women leaving, but that abuse is not triggered by her. It does not matter what she or other women do or do not choose to do with their lives, in the sense that if the man wants to be violent, the violence will occur and will keep occurring until she is able to get away from him or until one or both of them are dead. And we have seen that happen in so many cases. So I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that there aren't certain kinds of situations that present an increased risk of violence for women. I accept that completely. But what I don't accept is the construction that somehow it's her triggering his violence. And I think that's really important for understanding what's going on here, because he's the one that's punishing her, and ultimately he's punishing her for being a woman, and a woman who is under his control, that is socially supported. The other point I would just make, and this is really a sidebar to the case that's brought us here today, but I think it is important to recognize that domestic violence is often accompanied by sexual abuse. Sexual abuse, which I and others have argued is often fueled by pornography, and which may become increasingly bizarre, painful, and degrading. More than 50% of women who are abused by their male partners are also sexually abused by them, and there are lots of different studies that show that again and again. And I would ask you, what's the trigger of that? What is it that she's doing to trigger that violence? She doesn't trigger it at all. He triggers it. And I have to say, in sort of 2 decades now, I guess, of working and studying in the area of violence against women and the law, the most grotesque forms of sexual abuse I have ever seen are the ones that occur in spousal relationships. The most degrading, the most prolonged, are the ones that occur in the relationships that are supposed to be the most intimate, the relationships that are supposed to be the caring, trusting relationships. And yet we continue to see a denial of that kind of violence. And the example I would give in the Canadian context is the recent case of J.A. at the Supreme Court of Canada. Some of you may have seen that reported in the newspapers. And it was a case that we were told decided whether Canadian law recognized a concept of advanced consent to sexual intercourse. And the case was widely reported as being a case about a man and a woman who had engaged in some kind of sexual adventure in which she had agreed to be choked into unconsciousness and to let him sexually assault her while she was unconscious. And there was much discussion about women agreeing, and that was somehow part of their autonomy. And in fact, 3 justices in the Supreme Court of Canada actually took that view and said that that was part of recognizing women's autonomy, their ability to make that decision. And erased from this discussion as it proceeded through these layers of court to the Supreme Court of Canada was the reality of what happened in that case, in which a brutally violent and dangerous man who had been convicted on 2 prior occasions of assaulting this woman had actually forcibly choked her into unconsciousness, raped her in a very violent and degrading way that left her with injuries. And finally, when he said to her, "I'm coming after the kid, if you leave me," she said, "I am reporting you to the police. I'm going to tell what you did to me." And that was erased by him saying, threatening her until she said, "Well, actually, we played sexual games and, it was all part of something that we agreed to." And ultimately, the Supreme Court of Canada, in a decision in which the 4 women judges were all in the majority, said there can be no advanced consent to sexual contact, which is a great holding. But what was lost from the decision was any of the history of the domestic violence that put those parties before the court, and any explicit rejection of the complete and utter nonsense that this was a sexual adventure and a woman, a spiteful woman, bringing a false complaint of sexual abuse after the fact. And so it's that kind of narrative that comes up again and again and again, is really embedded in our understanding of male violence against women here as well. Now, when I say that women's actions are not a trigger of men's violence in this way, I'm not saying that the violence isn't premeditated, that somehow it's just men lashing out in a sort of uncontrolled sort of way, because the injuries that men inflict show that they can be very calculating about the kind of violence they inflict, either because they're trying to do something like stop a woman from continuing her studies, or because they're trying to do it in a way that can't be seen, and that will be hard to prove later on. And those same men, the ones who are supposedly so out of control at what women have done, are the ones that 5 minutes later, when the police are knocking at the door, are totally in control and calm and not punching the police officer, and are able to control themselves then. So I just want to try to open up some space for us to think a little bit about the way that these cases are sometimes described and some of the assumptions that are embedded in that. The second topic I want to cover just briefly, because I know that other speakers have said and have something to say about this, but is the rule of law and the discussion that I've heard about domestic violence laws in Bangladesh and whether they're effective or not. And it's true that I've had a look at that law, at least as it's been translated and reported, and I certainly see problems on the face of the domestic violence legislation in Bangladesh, although I'm glad that they have it. Not the least of which of those problems is the fact that the penalty for a false complaint by a woman is twice as high as the penalty for the assault itself. And so there are obviously some problems with a law that is predicated on that. But I think it's important, and I'd echo what others have had to say on this point, that we shouldn't kid ourselves that we are so much better off here. The recent move to abolish the long gun registry, a registry that was started in part based on the lobbying of feminist anti-violence activists in response to the Montreal massacre, is one example of how violence against women in Canada has really receded, I think, in some ways from our political consciousness. The other thing I thought I would just kind of point out to you is that Statistics Canada just last week released a report on shelters for abused women in Canada in 2010. And I think the numbers in this report are maybe kind of startling to some Canadians. But they report that in 2010, in a period from April 2009 to April 2010, 64,500 women sought admission to a battered women's shelter in Canada. That's a lot of women. That doesn't even count the children that they bring with them. More than 2/3 of those were new admissions, so women who had not sought admission to a shelter before. Those are only the women who have taken the brave and remarkable step of leaving and seeking shelter at one of these locations. And more than 60% had not reported the violence that they experienced to the police. That is a lot of women when you consider the population of this country, and it is not a number that is going down. It's remaining stable or increasing slightly, and frankly might increase more if there was more capacity in shelters in some locations. So the numbers here are high. And why are they so high? I mean, we have laws in Canada, we have a functioning police force, we have the rule of law. Well, I mean, I would argue that the failure to enforce the law consistently breeds contempt for it. And what is really needed for women in terms of a legal response is certainty of response. Women have to know and believe that when they call the police will come, the police will treat it seriously, the police will separate the abuser from them and will not arrest them as well for fighting back. They need to have confidence in that procedure and that it will work and work consistently. Not that it might work for them or it might not. I think we also need to recognize that for many women, the effects of abuse are cumulative. It is abuse at the hands of multiple men over time. That's particularly true for Aboriginal women in this country, but I think it's true for other women as well. And so the ability to respond and to trust the system of laws and the criminal justice system is affected by the cumulative nature of that abuse. And I'll just end by saying, and this is maybe an odd thing for a lawyer to say, particularly a lawyer who studies the criminal law, but you know, we can't expect the criminal justice system to be the only solution to male violence against women. The criminal justice system can have some deterrent effect. It's largely reactive. But it's really up to all of us to stop violence against women. It's up to both women and men to stop violence against women. It's mostly up to men to stop abusing women, I would say, which is the quickest way to end violence against women. But it's up to all of us to speak out and to organize and to not depend solely on the criminal law to solve this problem. What we need actually is something much broader than the criminal law, and what we need is sex equality. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Janine. That's actually a really nice segue to our last speaker, who is Tyseer Aboulnasr. She's the Dean of Applied Science here at UBC, a dean of mostly men, right? Tyseer, in a faculty.
The nurses, yes, the nurses. Yeah.
Right, and who also has a rather special background as a Egyptian-Canadian. So we moved from law to a broad perspective about sexual equality, I think, and some issues that you might have to talk about. Thanks, Tyseer.
I've spoken before a couple of times at St. John's over here, and when they asked me to speak this time, I actually said no in the beginning, and I said it's about time for me to stop talking about things that I don't know much about. And then I got really upset at a couple of things, and I sent them back, and they said, I want to come. And then And then, to be honest, listening to all of you, and this happened when I spoke at the rape center as well, I get completely confused. And I have to be honest, so you're gonna, sorry Henry, you're gonna get my worst presentation today, because I'm sitting there and I am completely and utterly messed up into what I was planning to say, and I'm gonna explain why. Initially I thought, okay, there we go again. When I heard this, the whole world is gonna present this, that look at them in Bangladesh, look at them as Muslims, because I am a Muslim as well, along with being a Canadian and Egyptian, and a practicing Muslim, not one who's avoiding the religion, a publicly practicing Muslim. So I said, here we go again, and it's going to be them. So I thought I'm going to carry my flag as to this is not them, and I'm going to come in here and say, let's turn the mirror and look at us. I should have known better. I should have known better to think that the panel of the people over here are going to carry that flag for me, that I did not need to carry it. But what happened is, after I'd said no, there's one of those shows on television, CSI or Criminal Minds, one of those. I put the television on when I'm working on the side. And there it was this Iranian woman in there. The Iranian husband was killed. And they were investigating the killing of the husband. And the woman was wearing a black scarf like this, but she was actually speaking good English. So I said, wow, okay, we're moving up now. We're presenting her as a regular, normal human being who can, I mean, the son acted as a weird guy and women are not allowed to speak and all of that, but the woman was speaking for herself. So I said, okay, we're moving on. It was a very open-minded perspective that the FBI was going in there to treat them as potential terrorists, because every Iranian is a potential terrorist. And there's the regular police that they were the more enlightened people, and they recognized that, come on, I mean, this is stupid. I mean, why are you doing this? And they were looking after the well-being of the family as they were trying to solve it. And then you have this really strange woman. I really have no idea what her name is, the star of the show. All I remember is she has this incredibly red lipstick that she has on. But then when they crack it at the end, as it turns out, the husband was about to send the woman to Iran with the kid to basically save them from the corruption of the Western world over here. So he was going to send her over there, and she just couldn't go back over there. She didn't want to go back over there. And there is this very kind-hearted white male Canadian who is going to save the damsel in distress, and he volunteered to kill the husband for her to save her. Okay, fine. I'm watching it. Okay, maybe she had an affair. She didn't have an affair. I mean, who knows? So in the end, they cracked it. And what stuck with me is that this police officer who was, or a prosecutor, or whatever she is, who was trying to find the culprit in this, who was throughout the show the open-minded one that after September 11th now has been enlightened enough to know that not every person from the Middle East is a potential terrorist. She just looked at the end when she cracked it, and she had this really sad look on her face, and she, all she had to do is file for a divorce. And what you guys are saying over here is that she had filed for a divorce, and if she had been the perfect white, blonde Canadian, she had a really high chance of getting killed in there. But it was intriguing how because she's from that culture, she couldn't file for divorce. But if she had been one of us people over here, she could have filed for divorce, and all she had to do is fill the application. And I just looked at her. I mean, every swear word I know. It's just going through my head. And it was horrific on two counts, that it was literally, a really nice blow and stab to the whole culture. But the other part of it is trivializing all the people over here who cannot, have the option of filing for divorce, but they know that it comes with a consequence. So that thing really pissed me off. And then in the office, one of the ladies that work in the office with me when I was getting my coffee, and she started chatting, and she said, "Can you just believe these people over there and what they do?" And she was utterly oblivious to the reality that it might not happen in exactly the same way over here, but it sure happens. So I'm going to spare you the pain of, because when I decided to come, I said, okay, let me educate myself. And I just went in and I started reading about some of the things. And you obviously give a first-hand experience of what happens in Canada. And take it to a bigger thing. One of the most troubling things in there is this whole business of using rape as a punishment in war. As they call it now, rape as a weapon of war. And it's an actually pretty cheap weapon. It really doesn't cost money. And as long as the man is there and is able, we can do it over and over and over again. And it's really quite frightening. Apparently the first time it started was in the 30s at some point. Then in Bangladesh, of all places, in 1971, the Muslim women in Bangladesh were targeted when they were trying to separate. Then we had a lull, and then we started getting into Bosnia, where we are looking at 50,000 women who were raped purposefully, not just by the way and just for fun, purposefully to impregnate them with the baby of the enemy, so that you will have me inside of you. And you think, and to me what's troubling is the human capacity for evil. And I can understand you're going to kill me because you need my car. You're going to kill me because you need my country. You're going to kill me because because of whatever. But to actually think of impregnating someone because you know it's going to kill them, that their kid comes from a lineage that is considered to be bad in their culture. It's just a horrific example. Now you go into Congo and the numbers are crazy. You're talking 200,000 women being raped. Rwanda, I found it quite shocking that in my own country, in Egypt, when I started reading about what was happening under Mubarak, that rape was actually used in Egypt as a way, not just of humiliating the women or entertaining the men, it was used as a way of torturing the men. So it was a man trying to break the spirit of another man by using the woman. Yeah. So I would rape you in front of your husband or your father or your brother. I really don't care about hurting you. I'm getting at him. I'm getting at him. And it was quite intriguing, the psychology of it. And the fact that these women in Egypt, which is a fairly conservative country when it comes to issues like that, were going in public and describing, and I'm reading this book and the woman's name is there. It's not J.A. or it's so-and-so. And the husband, like she was describing, and they took me in the room and then they brought him in and they sat him down and then they did this and this and this and this. And they were going public with that. But it was, I don't know how you guys would explain this, that this was a way of torturing the other men as opposed to a way of torturing the women. And you look at it, and I don't know if, and that's the part that's confusing me. I don't know if it is my engineering background and the fact that I work so much with engineers, with men, and I actually question myself every time I sit in a group like this. Have I been normalized myself? Have I somehow learned to ignore the signs? Because I tend to look at this and say this is violence. I don't describe it as male violence. I describe it as violence. And I don't know if this is good, if this is the bigger me, or if this is the more brainwashed me. And that's the part that confuses the daylights out of me as well. Because I tended in my own job where everybody, almost everybody I work with would be men. And I would get people after a difficult meeting and say, did you realize that what this guy did in there? He would have never done this if you were a man. And I says, really? I thought he was just a jerk. And I would always explain it. I mean, and I always thought that this is good, that I'm not aware. I'm not thinking consciously that this is targeted at me, so I'm just going. And I don't think of that. And sometimes when I sit in groups like this, I say, am I being an idiot now by not thinking of this? And I'm not sure what the answer is. But it was quite enlightening for me to realize that this is happening in Egypt and across the border in Israel. Apparently 200,000 women are being abused every year, and the explanation in the article was, it's just not justification, but the explanation, because the country is under so much stress. The men are taking it out on the women. It's a violent environment that we're in. And it just says, okay, why are they not taking it out on the other men? Why are they taking it out on the women? And you just look at it, and I think what scares me to death, and as I said, I had a whole pile of things that I was going to say, but that have been said, but what scares me to death is the capacity of evil in human beings. I'm more focused on the capacity of human beings to commit things as evil, as what happened with Rumana. And the reality is that some women actually do the same. And we were talking earlier, much more smaller percentage, but the cases in Egypt where a woman finally loses it after abuse of a husband, abusive relationship, she doesn't just kill. She does it well. She chops, she does things that you think no woman would have ever been able to do. And I look at that and it scares me that we have inside of us as human beings the capacity to be violent to one another in such a way. One of the things I picked up, which was really nice, and they were defining the roots of violence. And they're saying the roots of violence are founded in the belief that the needs, feelings, or beliefs of one person or group are more correct or more important than those of another person or group. This fundamental inequality creates a rationale for humiliation, intimidation, control, abuse, even murder. And obviously this was violence in general, that it's the belief that I, as a person, am better than you, or my life is better than yours. So if the world has to choose who dies, I'm worth more than you are because you are less. And once you get into the capacity of convincing yourself that human life and human dignity can be ranked, where some are higher than others. Yes, indeed, women end up being at the bottom. But that ranking actually goes beyond women. There is the cultural ranking, where the lives of my people are more important than the lives of your people, whoever your people are, but my people, their life is worth more. So when push comes to shove, 100 of yours, I can kill them to save one of mine because my personal life is better than yours. So when you go into women, to me, the very first step in subjugation or doing is to get the woman to actually believe that her life is not worth much, that she doesn't deserve that. Because if you really want a woman to stay in an abusive relationship, it doesn't get to the point of killing in one day. It grows over time. And I always look and say, and like this idiot lady on TV, why didn't she file for divorce? Why didn't they leave? Yeah, when you're looking at it after 5 years and you say, why didn't she leave? Obviously, you're standing outside and you're, why didn't she leave? This is really bad. But she's not you. And her view of herself is not your view of yourself. It's been destroyed, one piece at a time, over 5 years. And you see that, again, I'll go on my analogy with Egypt, the Egyptian people as a whole under Mubarak. The reason people waited that long is that they really were convinced that we can't do any better than this. We're just not going to be able, we don't deserve better. And until now, you'll get the people who are being negative with it, we're never going to make it work. Why? Why? But that's step number one, that you get a man who believes, in this case, that his rights, his needs, are worth a whole lot more than those of the woman. And then to get the woman to accept that her needs are worth a whole lot less. And then you have an environment that is perfect for violence. And I'm taking it outside of the women's context, and I do not intend in any way, shape, or form to undermine the specific part of men against women. But I again, on a personal basis, and I'm as I said, I'm all confused, so I do apologize that the thoughts are not well connected. And I do tie them with general violence and politics and the whole pile of things. Abu Ghraib was a perfect example of violence. How do you take a bunch of normal human beings and you turn them into people who have enormous capacity for evil? Enormous capacity for evil. And the one that, and I remember I was watching this, the one that struck me the most was the young lady. Because she was about, I don't know what her name was, but she was about 19 years old. And my kids were around that time. And as you know, 19-year-old kids do really stupid things, but they don't think of torturing human beings. It's not in their mindset. And this was an 18 or 19-year-old girl that was smiling and taking pictures relative to this. And I kept looking at her. I says, what the hell did they do to you to get you to be that evil? And of course, what did they do to the other guys? And the first step was to convince them that those on the other side are not equal human beings. They're evil. So dehumanize the other side. And then it becomes very easy to be violent against them. And when it comes to women, dehumanize that woman. She's worthless. And if you manage to actually convince her that she's worthless, then the job is done, because she's going to keep taking it forever. And I mean, when we come in and try and say, okay, how do you stop that? I tend to phrase it, and as I was talking, and I really am confused. So if I'm very wrong, and you've done it before with some of my professors, so feel free to shred me to pieces. But I actually do look at this as a human rights issue in general, because if we, in our society, allow ourselves to give rights to some people selectively and to take them away from others, if we decide that human life and human rights are things that you actually earn, in the sense that I'm going to decide whether you deserve them or not, as opposed to there's certain fundamental things that you're right. So even if you're nagging the person, even if you are doing this, you have a right to be safe. This is not subject to, this is not dependent on you earning the right to do that. This is a right you have. If we compromise human rights on other issues, then this is easy to compromise on. If we value human rights as a whole, then this is not going to be compromised upon. And that comes to the famous quote that I'm not going to say very well, when people say that when they came to the, I don't know what the quote was, when they came to the gypsies, for example, I said, I'm not a gypsy, so it's not me. When they came to this, said, oh, this is not me. And by the time they came to me, there was nobody left. And what I'm arguing for over here, if we look at that, if the court system is our very last resort, and again, I would say, as one of the people who are stereotyped after September 11th, I have massive respect for the court system, because indeed it is the absolute last resort that's left for people to establish their rights. But that court system, if we don't defend it in general, for the rights of the blacks, the rights of the Jews, the rights of the Muslims, the rights of the women, the rights of anybody, if we don't protect the concept of all lives are equal and they're all worth the same, and the sense of dignity, it is not selective and it's not dependent on your social status or your gender or your religion or your background, compromise it on one and the rest will follow. And I've been taught by a number of your colleagues in Ottawa about how it's a question of the principle that matters. So if one starts to say violence in general is not something that will be tolerated, period. And of course, it's by consequence, violence against women is not going to be tolerated. But it's, to me, it is this recognition that we actually do have a horrific capacity for violence as human beings. And it's inside all of us, because some of the best people become violent and as Abu Ghraib, again, is a perfect example. None of these people presumably were psychopaths before they went over there. But something happened in their training, and something pushed them to the point of not just doing it, enjoying it. And that, to me, there is a need to acknowledge that inside all of us, there is this capacity for violence. And the question becomes, we need to be aware of it, and we need to learn how to control it, and we need to have the system in place to stop it. And of course, if I have more propensity to do it because in my community, this is being done easier than in other communities, then I need to be much more aware. So if I try and end on a positive note, I was asking myself, what can one do to reduce this? And because I'm looking at it from a human rights perspective, my argument would be, if we can raise women who value themselves, who see their lives as worth something, and who recognize that, you know what, I honestly don't give a hoot whether you think I look good or not. I honestly I'm not gonna turn myself into your pleasure toy, in a sense, because I am who I am, and if you like me, you like me, if you don't, you don't, but I am who I am. If we bring up the young girls with that sense of respect for themselves, and if we bring up the young boys with the realization that their life is worth a lot, but it's not worth anything more than that of the other people, then you have less likelihood for people to abuse one another, then I have to depend on you, on the court system, that the ones that actually fall through the cracks have to be punished, and the ones that need help to go back to the rape center, find it. But for us to get all excited about Rumana now, and like you said earlier, Louisa, and raise the money and really feel good about ourselves, and we brought her from this evil place back to the safety of UBC, and you've got the whole medical machinery of UBC that's going to help you, and then we all walk away and feel good. Yes, we should feel good, but we should remember that we have a government in place that does not believe in the human rights aspect, that does not see the need for we have a government that one of the very first things they did is take away the $3 or $4 million that were in place for Canadians who want to challenge the government on human rights issues. That's $3 million in the budget of Canada. And we need to connect the dots, because the violence against women is, in my mind at least, part of a bigger violation of human rights.
Thank you so much. I think it's quite evident that we have very broad human rights issues. And I think Tyseer brought up the issue as well of female complicity with violence that is also has to be thought of. But let us open up to the floor questions for the panel, or people who have opinions they'd like to state.
I just wanted to make 3.
Would you like to say who you are first, and then?
I'm actually a former resident of the college
Uh-huh.
of the UBC, and I work as a counselor in the Stop the Violence program at Family Services of the North Shore. I also teach sociology and psychology at a college. So that's my time. I'm from Brazil originally, but I've been Canadian for a while now. I wanted to compliment particularly Louisa and Susan for having highlighted so well the fact that this is a problem that does not pertain only to brown people. I think that was one of the remarks that has been missing from the mainstream media as usual, but also from some of the academic discussions that I've heard on violence against women in general, and in the case of Rumana Monzur specifically. So I wanted to compliment you on having started your talk with that, and you also mentioned that obviously as an Egyptian woman you couldn't have not got into that can of worms. The other comment that I wanted to make is that I think that, and I'm not sure if you mentioned that, Susan, and I might have missed it because of my broken English or something, but I think that one of the reasons why women don't leave does not necessarily relate to the fact that they don't think they will have adequate official response from the police or other institutions, but also because often they are caught into the double whammy of being threatened to have their child removed, because often the children are witnesses of partner abuse, and that becomes part of the horrible soup that they have to digest afterwards. So just an additional thought. Yeah. And the third comment that I wanted to make relates a bit to what she was saying about, she kept, I forget your name.
Tyseer.
Yes. I guess that's my psychology background speaking for me. We're often thinking about men, or people in general, but men specifically who commit these violent crimes, as having a particular kind of personality or mental health issues. And I think that it would have been very interesting to have brought someone like Donald Dutton from forensic psychology from UBC to speak about the abusive personality, although I think that would just bring a perspective that is often mentioned in the mainstream media again to justify what we know is actually a systemic issue. Right? I would want to just build that castle so that we could quickly destroy it. As, of course, I'm not denying that there are some people who will have particular issues that pertain to themselves individually. However, this is more than anything an institutional systemic problem that needs to be acknowledged as such, and not just where brown people live, where they come from, but right here in the center of the world as well.
We're quite aware that we actually don't have any men on the panel, and that will be the next step, I think, because quite clearly it is a human rights issue that we're discussing, not a female issue.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.
Can I just respond to
you
that?
can,
I'm
Janine.
actually not sure that in a panel on violence against women, I feel I need men on this panel. I'm delighted to have men's support for women taking the lead on this issue. If men want suggestions about things that they can do to stop violence against women, I think there are many women who can give them all kinds of suggestions. But I actually don't feel I have to apologize for not putting men on panels when I speak about violence against women. So that's just my perspective on this issue.
Here, here.
But
Now, can I jump in on that?
Please do.
Yeah, because I don't think it's a question of apology, but I think if you bring the men on, then it doesn't become a women's issue, it becomes a society's
Human
issue.
rights issue.
So that they have to be part of it. I don't want them in to speak on behalf of the women, because the women can't speak on, I mean, I agree with you on that side, but somehow, I mean, as women can and should and always should try and stop this on their own, but it's not going to be resolved if the guys don't come into it. So to me, I would say having them on the panel in the right context and having the right people on the panel is not a question of the women not being able to present themselves, but it's a question of ensuring that the men feel that this is as much their problem as it is. I don't know, but again,
My take on it is, I agree with Janine that the world is a man's world, and their platform is the mainstream media. It is other world conferences, world banks. They have plenty of opportunity to take the space to do the right thing. We're carving out one small night together to group as women to talk about what is predominantly the violence committed by men. Yes, it is a human rights issue for sure, but let's look at, like, mostly the violence is being done by men. And I do agree that, or sometimes trouble myself over, are these men sick or evil, as you've suggested, and could I be capable of that? And the reality is that I couldn't. As a woman, I would need an entire court system and police system and community to collude with me to be able to get away with that much violence. If I hurt someone, even if I scratch someone, I face arrest. You need an entire society to cooperate with sexism in order for men to get away with that much violence. And that's why on a small night tonight, when we're brought together because a woman was savagely beaten, I think it is entirely okay to carve out a little bit of woman-only space.
Get together a group of, and I don't know how many volunteered or whether it really took off, but a group of men to talk about violence, and specifically male violence, and then, you know, try to, within that context, move the discussion forward. So there are different ways to think about, I mean, I don't disagree with you, Tyseer, at all.
I don't
but-
disagree with what
Yeah.
you're saying, that it is okay to not have men. I don't feel
it's
bad.
okay to
that
have
there are
them
no
too,
men.
but I just don't
Yeah,
have to
yeah,
apologize
yeah,
for
yeah,
their
yeah,
absence.
I also want to say
Because they've got lots of space, I think.
Yeah.
one thing
Exactly.
I did also want to say is that our Rape Crisis Center Transition House is one of the very few that does let men volunteer with us. And there is a committee called the Friends of Rape Relief group. There's about 10 men there right now, and they desperately need more help. They do about one fundraising activity a month. It's not a huge commitment, but you might be shocked to know this, that rape crisis centers in BC actually get no government support, none. And the money that we get for the transition house is not enough to run the house by any means. So the amount of money that those men raise is actually enough for us to keep the Rape Crisis Center open. It's real concrete aid, and it's actually only because of the men's help that we were ever even able to buy that transition house, because they joined that committee and they're still there. So if you want to be a part of that, give me your name and I can get you connected to those men.
Okay.
Okay.
You had a question.
Yeah, just to build off of what's being said, I do a little bit of anti-violence work, and a lot of times if I'm out on an info booth or whatever, a lot of men will come up to me and say, well, what about violence against men? Hear it 100 times a day, all the time. And often my response is, well, you know, if you think that's a pressing social issue, by means, like, go ahead, raise the torch, do some organizing, put in the effort, and I've yet to see a single man follow through. because obviously it's just a retort meant to dismiss and further silence women in their efforts. And I think I sympathize with what Louisa's saying and what Janine's saying, in that if you're a man who is passionate about getting involved and taking responsibility, do it yourself. Don't wait for an invitation from a panel. These are women who are doing this work all the time. They've been, in a lot of cases, committing their lives to it. They have their plates full, answering calls, 1,400 calls a year, and housing all these women. You know, I just think like we're pretty freaking busy, and you know, I'm looking for this direction. You know, like, well, you know, tell me what to do, or I want to help. And it's like Louisa says, you have powerful platforms. Be creative and use it. So that's sort of what I'm thinking. And then building off of that, what I was going to say before is that I'm wondering if we can speak a little bit to the role of masculinity in sort of connecting what Louisa was saying about when violence being about power and control, and Janine talking about how when that masculinity is threatened, that's when we see this violence playing out. And I think what Tyseer is saying about Abu Ghraib is, like you said, a perfect example of violence. I think it's a perfect example of when hegemonic masculinity is being just infused in an entire institution, so much so that women who are a part of the institution adopt it as the ideal. And I think that what Janine's saying about pornography and all the other, you know, things that float around that come from that system, where we've now created being one of the boys as being the best role a woman can play in society. And I know that, as you're saying, Tyseer, you've caught yourself, or feel like you've been brainwashed. I mean,
I wonder, to be honest.
I mean, the same with me, as someone who's been to clubs where my reserve table is around a pole, and going, what am I doing here? You know, and like, and actually not leaving right away. You know, because you're sucked into this. This is what a liberated woman does. Things that fulfill every fantasy of a man. And I think that really is what we're getting to when we talk about women being complicit in this type of violence and complicit in the sexism. I think it is rooted in that proliferation as masculinity, this very problematic masculinity as the ideal.
Because it's interesting when we talk about, you know, Abu Ghraib and what could have brought some 19-year-old little slip of girl, right, to engage in that kind of brutality. And you talk about, you know, the conditioning system of the military and the dehumanization of the other, and I think all of those things are true. And of course, they're making porn, right, of those men at Abu Ghraib. I mean, that's what they're doing with those photographs of the torture, right? They're making torture porn. But then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, I mean, that's horrific, but we do see this, you know, entire sort of military, it's a war thing producing that. What produces the men who do that in their daily life, who are not part of any organization, who don't even have this military, American military machine telling them, you know, where are the ordinary men of the world getting those ideas that they can do these things to women and sometimes photograph it. Well, you know, where is that coming from? And so I think that's a very important and very difficult question to ask.
The cultural mores are carried on by men and women. So if you look at foot binding, for example, it's women who have typically been involved in doing the foot binding and in maintaining tradition. So we have to be careful, I think, about parsing out the sexes and see that we are all indeed complicit in carrying forward cultural mores and ideas. And it would be nice, could we move a little bit perhaps to how we might help Rumana in our discussions?
I think we could, but you are asserting a political position without discussion, so I want to be on the record as objecting.
But this is what panels are for.
No woman benefits from foot binding. I want to be very clear about that. That of course there are times when women don't act great, or women behave badly, or we do behaviors that are violent, and it's not to say that we never are, but there, as an oppression, no one is benefiting from that violence other than men.
At least not collectively, I would say,
Right.
Louisa. I
Right.
don't think gender comes with any political or
Right.
social guarantees, and collectively women will not benefit from foot biting. However, individually, some women may very well
Certainly
see themselves
socially,
as benefiting.
certainly
Right.
benefit socially.
It's a mutually constitutive issue. I don't see
Correct.
porn or the media as having some sort of a hypodermic needle that inserts thoughts into people's minds. I think that society is feeding the media as well as the media is feeding society. It's a mutually constitutive issue. But I also want to go on the record by saying that the reason why I suggest that Donald Dutton is not because he's a man, but because he's a very competent forensic psychologist. But I also want to go on the record by saying that, again, gender does not come necessarily with a political guarantee. And I'm all for women-only spaces in particular circumstances, as well as any other subordinate class to have their own specific spaces, because as we know, the mainstream spaces are filled enough with people who hold power. However, there is no guarantee that's necessarily attached to gender or national identity or color or whichever notion of race that you may have. There's a lot of oppression that's attached to that, but not necessarily a political identity. So
Thank you.
that's my 2 cents.
Anything more we want to hear from the audience?
My English is not good because I'm
Could you
from
start?
Mexico. But I think the problem is very complex. A friend of mine, she has a PhD. He didn't tell me about that he was attacked for her husband during 10 years during that time until he hit her, and she had several pregnancies, but she didn't have the baby because her husband hit her. But she told us that she has a problem with the body and physical body. And when I discovered that, I was pretty sad. I feel very angry because she was prepared. Doing a PhD is not easy. When I discovered this discovery was in 2004, maybe almost 10 years ago, and she's not divorced right now from the guy. I don't understand because but she knows the law. She knows places like you have for protect the women, but inside her decision, she didn't have the correct decision for her, and she decided to stay more time with that man that hit her, but because the violence not just to hit or to rape, it's also with your voice or phrases day by day. Maybe your mother in our families gave us that kind of culture that support some phrases from the man on another person. For example, the person that decides to be homosexual or another preference sexuality. In Mexico, they must be quiet because the man or either woman can say be violence with them with the phrases So the problem is very complex. That it's not just political policies. I don't know the name. Political from the government. It's not just for the family or the women. When I spoke with my friend, she told me that one of the problems was I'm a prepared woman. I decided to be married with these men. I choose them. It wasn't a regiment marriage. In what time of my life I would like to speak in Spanish. How to say that I'm a prepared, I know all the facts, but in the facts I make a mistake. But she didn't make the correct decision right now to get rid of
him,
of that person and have a better life quality. 15 years have been passed that I met the situation. I know the situation. I would like to say more, but my English is not so good. I would like to speak in Spanish. Well, that's all. The idea is very complex.
It is very complex.
I came from Mexico, and there are a lot of women rape. It's more, the numbers is highest than Canada. That's all.
You said it all. Do you want
a quick
to
response? I'd like to say I think that you're an incredibly good friend to stick by her for 15 years and to not turn her back on her. And sometimes that's what it takes, is women like you that make the difference and come tonight and say that. I think it's also a stark reminder that you can't just get a good education and a good job and think that you'll escape it, and that it's only collectively that we can solve the problem. And I think we underestimate, we talked a little bit tonight about women not having self-respect. I don't actually subscribe to that. I see lots of women in the house with tons of self-respect and self-love. But I do think that it's extremely important for women in our society to be with a man, much more so than it is for a man to be with a woman. If a man's just out in the world on his own, single, he's a traveler, he's an adventurer, he's just a guy being a guy. But for us, it's deeply important to either be a mother, a girlfriend, a wife, and the idea of romantic love is huge in our society, and getting past that is a challenge every day, I think, for every woman.
May I speak to that?
A comment back, yes, and then we'll bring this to a close.
Yeah, so I would like to comment on that, because I've been through a violence relationship, and I am probably the last person my friends would know would actually sustain this kind of abuse. Because I'm from a family who's female is dominant in my family, and I have really strong personality. But I think all of you know about the victim psychology. When you're being kidnapped, you eventually see that man who is abusing you, who kidnapped you, as your savior. So I could speak to that and say any woman actually has the potential to be in a violence relationship and cannot escape. So my friends help me escape, so I echo that.
Yes. Thank you.
Good for you.
I just have a question for you guys, because
A bit louder.
sorry, I just have a question for, like, and I know who respond to this, but we talked a lot about different emotions here, but I haven't heard a lot about love. And that's something that I find with a lot of women, is that they stay because they say that they love the man, that they love their family, that you know, I mean, to what extent do you think that we can help women who are in situations like that, who we know that are in horrible relationships that we can see are affecting their health, are affecting their children? Because I think we know that there are patterns of like children who've witnessed violence or experienced traumas as young children or adolescents who grow up to re-perpetuate that kind of violence in their relationships because they think it's a norm. But how do we help women who think that love is all there is and that's why they're staying there? Because I think there's an intense emotional side to this, to why women stay in relationships, and it's not just logic. It's not, this is bad for me, you know, like I love this man. So, I mean, what would you guys' advice for women like that be?
Really good question.
The legal side. What do you comment on this?
Law isn't very good at dealing with law. But I think you've just named what is kind of at the heart of the last two comments. You know, why it's one, I mean, as the person at the back said, it's very complex. So love can be one reason why women stay tangled up, I think, with all these other things, including this cultural overlay of, you know, the importance of romantic love.
And the feeling that you can change the person.
Exactly.
But it seems to me that, I don't know, I mean, this isn't a legal answer at all. It just seems to me that, you know, I would like everyone to think that a loving relationship can also be a more equal and respectful relationship that, you know, anyway, but that's just a rather facile response. And
No, it's a good feminist
I don't think the
response.
lawyers can actually give a good law response to that question, but there might be others who can.
Time is rolling along, and I think we've kept you going.